I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our administrator. Administrator Jim Bridenstine was nominated by President Donald Trump, confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and sworn in as NASA's 13th administrator on April 23, 2018. Jim was elected in 2012 to represent Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he served on the Armed Services Committee and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Jim's career in federal service began in the U.S. Navy, flying the E-2C Hawkeye off the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier. It was there that he flew combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and accrued most of his 1,900 flight hours and 333 carrier-assisted landings. He later moved to the F-18 Hornet and flew at the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, the parent command to Top Gun. And as a reservist, he also flew counter-drug missions in Central and South America. After transitioning from active duty to the U.S. Navy Reserve, Jim returned to Tulsa, Oklahoma to be the executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum and Planetarium. Jim completed a triple major at Rice University and earned his MBA at Cornell University. He has 3 children, as do I, with his wife, Michelle. And so please join me in welcoming our NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Absolutely. Dr. Eugene, too, thank you for that great introduction. Thank you for not just my introduction, but the introduction to the public of your really phenomenal center. And just to be clear, because we have 10 centers across the United States of America, this is the first time we've done this on NASA TV, and of course you get the opportunity to present Ames on NASA TV for the viewing public. But in the future, we'll do this at other centers, and we'll have other centers present their capabilities. I think it's critically important for all of America to understand ultimately the capabilities that we bring to bear for our country as NASA. And of course, each one of these centers is important in that capability. So thank you for your service. You're doing a great job. Ames is spectacular, as all of our centers are. And I know that it's difficult to put together a NAC at your center in particular, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But it's important for our country to see what we do, and this is a great thing for you to spend time and effort putting together, so we appreciate you very much. General Lyles, thank you for being the chairman of this critically important committee. As everybody in this room is aware, and I hope more and more people get to be aware, NASA has its history in seeking advice. In fact, one of the slides that you showed, Dr. Tu, you showed that we have our history as NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, going all the way back to the 19-teens. I don't remember what the specific year was, 1915. So that's a long time ago, well before NASA existed. But at the same time, it was an advisory committee on aeronautics, and it helped our country really establish itself as the preeminent airfaring country at the time, and now we are the preeminent spacefaring nation on the planet. So what this group does, the NASA Advisory Committee, is it helps me as the NASA administrator and helps our agency ultimately be able to make good decisions that are in the best interest of our country, not only in aeronautics, but also in space, technology, discovery, exploration, and science, all of the things that are important for America to keep its technological edge in the world. So General Lyles, thank you for all of your service to this country, and of course your service here on the NAC, as you guys make excellent recommendations that we generally accept and sometimes don't. But either way, we want to get the best advice we can possibly get, and of course going around the room, it was not lost on me or anybody else how much expertise there is here in this room. So thank you all for participating in this today. So when we think about what we're up against as an agency, and I'll just start talking about where we are right now, and ultimately some of the space policy directives that I have as the NASA administrator coming from the administration, coming from the president. So he has already signed and issued 3 space policy directives. The first one is our return to the moon. Space Policy Directive 1 says that the United States of America is going to the moon. Now, people have said, well, we've heard this before. We go back to the Space Exploration Initiative of the 1980s, or the Vision for Space Exploration of the 2000s, early 2000s. We've had other programs in the past where the United States said we're going to the moon, and then sometimes, I should say previously, other than Apollo, we've gotten distracted, budgets change, and we ultimately don't accomplish the objective. Well, in this particular Space Policy Directive, there are some differences between what we're doing now and what we attempted to do back then. It starts with the fact that it specifically says that this time when we go to the moon, we're going sustainably. So it is on me to figure out how we get to the moon sustainably. In other words, we're not going to do flags and footprints again. We all look back fondly on Apollo, critically important mission for our country. But when it was over in 1972, and some would argue that it went a little longer with the Apollo-Soyuz project, but when it was over, we didn't go back to the moon. We left flags and footprints, and this time when we go, we're going to go to stay. We're going to go sustainably. That's in the President's Space Policy Directive 1. So how do we go sustainably? Well, we start by taking advantage of capabilities in this country that didn't exist even 5 or 10 years ago. We have commercial companies that can do things that weren't possible even just a few years ago. So we want to use those commercial capabilities that didn't exist to help develop this sustainable architecture. We also have, in the world now, more space agencies than we've ever had before, all over the world. And we want to partner with our international partners to have that sustainable architecture. And because of our commercial partners and our international partners, there are things happening that enable us to get to space in a way that we haven't been able to get to space before. The idea that we have reusable rockets. The idea that you can launch, imagine if you flew across the United States, you flew here to Ames in a 737, and when the mission was over, you threw the airplane away. How many of you would have flown here? It wouldn't have happened. But when you can reuse an airplane, we can drive down the cost and we can increase access to aviation. And now, we're on the brink of driving down costs and increasing access to space, which gives us new capabilities that we didn't have before because of reusability. We also want to make sure that if we're going to go to the moon sustainably, it's not just about reusable rockets, which are impressive in themselves, but we want reusable tugs to go from Earth orbit to lunar orbit. We want space stations around the moon that can be there for a very long period of time. And we want landers that go back and forth from that space station, or eventually space stations. We want those landers to go back and forth over and over again, reusing the landers themselves. This ultimately is how we create this architecture for a sustainable return to the moon. So in this particular case, Space Policy Directive 1 says that we're going back to the moon, we're going sustainably, we're going to utilize our commercial partners, we're going to utilize our international partners, and there's another piece here that's unique, never been done before. It's never been our policy as a country before. But the policy is this: we're going to utilize the resources of the moon. People say, well, what resources are on the moon? Well, from 1969, when we first landed on the moon, all the way up until 2008, we believed the moon was bone dry. And in 2008, a discovery was made by India that NASA then corroborated, and in a massive way. We now know that there are hundreds of billions of tons of water ice on the surface of the moon, especially at the poles. Well, what does that mean? Water ice represents life support. It's water to drink, it's air to breathe, oxygen. And of course, if you crack water into hydrogen and oxygen, it's also rocket fuel, the same fuel that's going to power the SLS, the same fuel that powered the space shuttles, Wayne. So this is a great opportunity for us as an agency to say, look, there are right now resources on the moon. We want to be able to prove out in situ resource utilization, using the resources of the moon to do more on the moon than we've ever been able to do before. So that's another change in our policy as a country. So all of this is very positive. The other thing that's important when we think about how do we get more access to more parts of the moon than ever before, we talk about the gateway, the idea that we're going to have this space station. And I want to be careful, because when we talk about a space station, people think about the International Space Station, this project that took all of these years to build, and of course, it's massive, and that's really not what we're doing with the gateway. What we're doing is we're putting a much smaller device in orbit around the moon that's going to have access by humans, but it's also going to be maneuverable. It's going to have solar electric propulsion. It can not only stay in that near rectilinear halo orbit where it can be for a very long period of time without burning any station-keeping fuel, in other words, a sustainable long-term mission in that orbit, but with that solar electric propulsion, it can also go to the L1 point and the L2 point and give us more access to more parts of the moon than ever before. Like I said, from 1969 all the way up until 2008, we believed the moon to be bone dry. Why is that? Well, that's because in the Apollo era, we went to just a few portions of the moon, in the equatorial regions. 6 missions, all critically important. But they did not give us everything we needed to know about our nearest neighbor, the moon. So we want to retire risk. We want reusable architectures. We want to use that, in essence, space station in orbit around the moon, the gateway. We want to use that to get to more parts of the moon than ever before. And this entire architecture needs to be published. It needs to be public. The interfaces, we want interoperability. Whether it's the power or the docking, we want everybody to look at it, whether you're a commercial partner or an international partner. If you want to build your own landers, we want you to build your own landers. And we want you to be compatible with our architecture between Earth and the moon and in orbit around the moon. We want you to be compatible. We want to be able to do more than we've ever done before. And so what we're going to do is build this critical infrastructure on and around the moon. So Space Policy Directive 1 is a big order. And the last piece of it is we want all of these capabilities to retire risk, prove in situ resource utilization, and we want to be able to replicate that at Mars. We talk about the gateway. Yes, it is true, the first gateway is about the moon. We want more access to more parts of the moon. We don't want to miss hundreds of billions of tons of water ice again. We don't want to miss that again. And we talk about what other resources might be there. We don't know. There could be trillions of dollars worth of platinum group metals. We know that there are, and I'm not saying there are, I want to be clear, but we know that there are rare earth metals that are extremely valuable. Well, they're not earth metals at all. They're asteroid impacts. And you know this because down at Arizona State University, you have the biggest archive of meteorites in the world. Those rare earth metals are asteroid impacts, and we know that the moon has had lots of asteroid impacts just like the Earth. But the moon doesn't have an active geology, and it doesn't have the hydrosphere that we have, which means those deposits could be just sitting there as they did a billion years ago. We don't know. I'm not saying that they are. But to the extent that they exist, we need to be actively working to make sure that we find them rather than somebody else. So that's really utilizing the resources of the moon and then retiring the risk, proving the capabilities, understanding human physiology. We know what happens when astronauts go into orbit, go into a microgravity environment for a period of 6 months to a year. We've proven that out on the International Space Station, which has been an extremely successful project for the United States of America and all of our international partners. We've seen it. We know that astronauts will lose 1 to 3% of their bone mass per month. We know that their neurovestibular systems will, when they come back into a gravity well, will take a bit of time to ultimately be ready for them to do activities like drive or ride a bike, do those kind of activities. And we know that the cardiovascular system gets deconditioned. There's other things we don't know, although we're learning more and more every day about what happens in the microgravity environment with physiology, but also in the radiation environment of space. So we're learning these things all the time. We're getting better understanding. But the question is this: do you want, for the first time, when we send somebody on a 7 to 9 month journey to Mars, do you want them for the first time proving all of this, all of the physiology challenge and proving that we can mitigate the physiology challenge? Do you want them proving that out on Mars, where your next opportunity to come home is 2 years away? Or do we want to retire all of this risk, both technologically, but also with human physiology? Do we want to prove it out first on a world that is only a 3-day journey home? If we have learned anything from Apollo 13, it is that we can have things go bad and still make it home. And in other words, turn a failed mission into a successful mission. We can do that from the moon. Something like that happens on the way to Mars, it doesn't work out so well. So that's why we have the moon. It can retire risk, we can prove capability, and then we can replicate it at Mars. So this is Space Policy Directive 1. And of course, most of that is going to fall on NASA and our commercial partners and our international partners. So we're looking for advice on how to make this happen in an effective way. Space Policy Directive 2 focuses on the regulatory environment. We know that there are more things happening commercially in space than ever before. Some of the challenges we have as a country is that some capital, in fact, a good bit of capital, is heading overseas. And the question is why? Is it because we don't have the technology or the capability? No, in fact, it's because we have a regulatory environment where some people would suggest that we don't have the ability to provide authorization and continuing supervision, which is required under our international obligations. So if somebody in the State Department says we don't have that ability, then launches don't happen. And if launches don't happen here, those capabilities go to other countries. And we want those capabilities coming here. We want capital flowing to the United States, not capital flowing out of the United States. So we've got to work on this regulatory environment. Space Policy Directive 2 focuses us on that regulatory environment. When we think of non-traditional space activities, commercial habitation, the idea that commercial operators are going to put space stations into orbit, that NASA can then be one customer of many customers, that's a good thing for us because it drives down cost. Think about robotic servicing of satellites, doing rendezvous and proximity operations. Again, that enables us to take care of the space environment, if you will, to make sure that we're not littering orbital regimes that could be damaging to future space missions. Think about, again, how do we utilize the resources of the moon commercially, or even mine an asteroid? These kind of activities, right now, we don't have in our country an agency responsible for that authorization and continuing supervision. Space Policy Directive 2 says that we're going to put that activity at the Department of Commerce. And friends, we have to make this a reality, because otherwise these capabilities will go abroad. Go back to Space Policy Directive 1. We're going back to the moon, and we're going with international partners, and we're going with commercial partners. But how do we get those commercial partners to be commercial partners if instead they're taking their money overseas? We want our commercial partners to stay here. We want to grow more commercial partners here. That's what Space Policy Directive 2 is all about. Then we have Space Policy Directive 3, which is another big challenge going forward. NASA is one of many agencies that is part of what's called the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. 13 space agencies from across the globe, NASA being one of them. This coordination committee has said that every 5 to 9 years we're going to have a collision in low Earth orbit similar to the Iridium Cosmos collision that we saw in 2009. That one collision resulted in thousands of pieces of orbital debris that is trackable. That means there's thousands more pieces that are not trackable. When I say trackable, we're talking about 10 centimeters or larger. Well, with all of this debris, that puts low Earth orbit in jeopardy. And of course, there's other activities happening in low Earth orbit, including in 2007, one of the nations of the world, and I'm not going to mention who it is here, but everybody here knows who it is, launched a direct ascent anti-satellite missile and knocked out a satellite of their own in low Earth orbit, resulting in a debris field that we are still dealing with today as an agency and as a nation. So this is resulting in a cluttered space environment, and we've got to make sure that we're protecting space, not just for our generation, but for generations to come. So Space Policy Directive 3 says we're going to take advantage of not just our current capabilities, but we're going to build capabilities to provide space situational awareness and space traffic management so that in the future we don't have these kind of collisions and these kind of challenges that could be detrimental to our country and really to the world for generations to come. So these are a lot of things that, again, Space Policy Directive 3 is not focused specifically on NASA, but we do have a role to play. Our role is to develop technologies, to develop capabilities, to partner with institutions, many of which, Dr. Tu, you talked about, academia specifically. How do we ultimately preserve the space environment for future generations? There's a lot of talent all throughout the United States. We need to tap into that. A lot of it's at universities. A lot of it is at those partner institutes that you talk about, virtual institutes. And NASA is going to be directing kind of the process by which we make those decisions and ultimately build those capabilities. In Space Policy Directive 3, that activity will ultimately reside within the Commerce Department. But NASA is going to be involved in developing those capabilities, just like we do for unmanned aerial systems and integrating them into the National Airspace System for the FAA. We develop those capabilities. Once they're developed, we transfer them over to another agency that is responsible for the regulatory environment. NASA is not a regulator. We don't want to be a regulator, but what we do is we do science and technology and we build capabilities. So we have a lot on our plate. 1, we're going to the moon. 2, we're looking at non-traditional space activities and making sure that at the end of the day we have an agency that can provide authorization and continuing supervision. And we're looking at within the agencies that currently do regulation for space activities that we're streamlining those regulations and making sure that ultimately somebody is responsible for them. Space Policy Directive 3 is space situational awareness and space traffic management. So a lot of activities. And of course, we'll be looking to the NAC, looking to folks in this room to give us the absolute best advice possible so that our country can continue to be not only the preeminent spacefaring nation, but also a preeminent nation in aeronautics, which of course a lot of that is done right here at Ames and at Armstrong, where I was yesterday, and other agencies or other centers across the country. So with that, if it's all right, General Isles, I'll let you take the helm back, and I'm here to answer questions and get feedback.
Jim, thank you very much, and thank you for that very, very compelling discussion about NASA and our nation's space program in the future. I'm wondering, though, this is the first time we've broadcast this on NASA TV.
Yeah.
And all of us are obviously very, very excited around this table. And probably those who tune into NASA TV they're all space geeks like we are.
Right.
So they're very, very excited about it. How do we get the message out better to the general public in the United States, not just of the future, but all the great things that are happening today with NASA and exploration and science and technology? It is such a compelling story. It's such an exciting story.
Yeah.
But the man on the street probably is not aware of one iota of the things that are going on. Your thoughts about what we can do differently?
So you're hitting on I think a key point, which is important to me as the NASA administrator. I've had the question before. The question is, what do you want your legacy to be as the NASA administrator? I get that when I do these town halls. I visit. I've got one more center you saw all the centers. Dr. Tu showed them all to you. We've got 10 centers across the country. This is my 9th one to visit. I've got one more to go. But I do these town halls with the different programs and projects at each of these centers, and I get this question a lot. And what I would like to do as the NASA administrator is get the word out how important space is to the lives of every citizen in the United States. So when we think about how we communicate, you mentioned NASA TV. Well, NASA TV is, that's satellite TV. Imagine that, NASA being broadcast on satellite TV, right? You talk about Dish Network or DirecTV. You talk about XM radio or internet from space, broadband from space. All of the ways we communicate. As a military pilot, we were sending high-resolution motion picture images all over the world so decision makers could make split-second, critically important decisions. All of that is possible because of a communication architecture that is commercialized. I want to be really clear, it's commercialized. This is not NASA architecture, but it was all blazed by a trail that NASA blazed. I mean, this capability is available to humanity because NASA led the way. We retired the risk. And when we retired the risk and we made it public, then others could take advantage of it and build these communication architectures that now all of humanity can benefit from. So I think that's a wonderful thing. The way we navigate, people are familiar with GPS, the way we produce food. I was at a swim meet with my children the other day in Oklahoma City, and the grandfather of one of the kids in the meet was from Nebraska. And he asked me, so what do you do? And I said, well, I work for NASA. And he says, well, what do you do for NASA? And I said, well, I'm the administrator. And he says, well, what does the administrator do? And right, yeah. And I said, well, I kind of run it, you know. And he says to me, well, now that I know, let me tell you about what's going on. In Nebraska, we're using NASA technology to know when to water, to know when to plant, when to harvest, how to allocate water effectively to maximize the growth of our crops. And he's now created this consortium of other farmers that are responsible for taking this out to all the farmers throughout Nebraska. So this is an amazing kind of development that is enabling the United States of America and others all over the world to feed more of the world than otherwise would be possible. And that's a great thing that NASA has done. So the way we communicate, the way we navigate, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we understand weather. You get up in the morning, you turn on, channel 2, whatever it is you watch, and you see that green blob on the screen, and you know when the weather's going to be over your part of the country. Well, 80% of the data that goes into that green blob is data from a satellite that was built by NASA for NOAA. So the way we predict weather and the way we understand climate, the way we do national security and disaster relief. We had a conversation earlier about GPS and how important it is. Now, when you think about banking transactions and the timing signal from GPS that ultimately goes through our wireless terrestrial networks, that's important for banking transactions. It's important for the flows of data across terrestrial wireless networks in general, and it's also important for the flows of electricity on the grid. So all of these things, we talk about how important space is to our everyday lives. Now, a lot of these capabilities are Department of Defense capabilities. A lot of them are commercial capabilities. A lot of them could be intelligence community, or it could be, pick your space kind of capability. Commerce, NOAA. But at the end of the day, all of these capabilities are available to the American public because NASA led the way. We retired the risk, and we made this available. It has elevated the human condition, not only for the United States, for all of the world. And you think about what part of the budget it is. We're talking about, at this point in American history, we're talking about 1/2% of the federal budget that has lifted and enabled all of this kind of capability. And I've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more. But if I can do anything, communicating that out to the world is important. How do we do that? I think I'm the first NASA administrator to tweet, which is kind of, I have gotten some feedback on that maybe that's not professional. But it's important. Why? Because we're trying to reach a new generation. And guess what they read? They read Twitter. And they read Facebook. And it's not just the new generation, I can tell you that. My parents are involved in that as well. So, but we want to reach more of the world than ever before. Social media is a big piece. And if I can do anything, the question about legacy, how do we get that message out? We can partner with all kinds of different communication capabilities. A lot of people don't realize the history here. You look at the NASA logo, the meatball. You guys know where the meatball came from? It was made by Walt Disney. That's the kind of partnership and the relationship. It was between Wernher von Braun and Walt Disney, that relationship, and they wanted to make sure that we put NASA into every part of American society, including Disney animations. And of course, they created the meatball. So these are the kind of things that we ought to be doing. Now, there's a whole host of things that we should be doing that would enable us to get the message out more. In some cases, we're constrained. We're constrained by traditional regulation. We're, in fact, maybe constrained by law. One of the things I'd like to introduce at this point is a new committee that we're standing up with your help, and I appreciate you. Is it all right if I kind of start that process?
Yes, sir. It was going to be my next question to ask about that committee. Go ahead, please.
Absolutely. So one of the things I think about is, my children can tell you all of the players on the Oklahoma City Thunder basketball team, or all of the players on the Houston Rockets, for example. They want to wear the shoes of the players on these teams, and They're embedded in the American culture in a way that is amazing. And that's good. I think that's fantastic. I'd like to see kids growing up, instead of maybe wanting to be like a professional sports star, I'd like to see them grow up wanting to be a NASA astronaut or a NASA scientist. And so how do we make that a reality? Don't get me wrong, there are kids that want to do that, but it's not nearly as prevalent as the sports stars. So we think about, I'd like to see, maybe one day, NASA astronauts on the cover of a cereal box, embedded into the American culture. And there's a lot of different ways that we can embed NASA into the American culture that maybe have been done historically but aren't done today. And if we can go back to that, I think it'd be good. We need to look at the regulation and the policy and the rules that have come about that created an environment that maybe is not as permissive as it has been historically. But if we follow through on commercializing low Earth orbit, which is important so that we can go further, we can use NASA resources to go to the moon and go to Mars. We need to commercialize low Earth orbit, make sure that there is no gap in human activity in low Earth orbit. If we're going to do that kind of activity, we have to figure out what are the ways that we can do that that are unique, that maybe haven't been tried before. And to do that, I have requested, and you have obliged, in the creation of a new regulatory and policy committee of the NAC. And I have appointed Mike Gold, whom I've known for a while, even in my previous life as a member of Congress, who is an attorney that can help us sort through what the reality is, maybe compared to some of the lore, if you will, and ultimately help us figure out what are the best ways to maximize the exposure and enable us to commercialize NASA, a lot of NASA's capabilities in low Earth orbit, so that we can do things, we can use taxpayer resources to go further and do more. So Mike, if you'd like to take a few minutes to talk about kind of what your direction is.
Yes. Thank you so much. Let me just begin by thanking you, Administrator Bridenstine, and the Chair, General Lyles, for this opportunity to serve on the NAC and for your support in forming this Regulatory and Policy Committee. NASA is famous for overcoming Herculean technological challenges, landing on the moon, putting rovers on Mars, and imaging far-flung planets and galaxies. However, in this new era of public-private partnerships and commercial space development, conquering regulatory and policy hurdles can be just as important to the agency as any engineering challenge that NASA may face. Therefore, the purpose of the Regulatory and Policy Committee will be to target and tackle barriers to achieving NASA's goals by providing expert, independent, and creative advice to the Council and the Administrator. There are a wide array of issues that the new committee will address, and I expect the list to evolve over time, but I wanted to take a minute to describe the initial topics that the Administrator has asked us to explore. The first set of issues relates to the International Space Station and private sector LEO operations. NASA must be free to do what it does best, to push the envelope of the final frontier, and more specifically, leveraging the SLS and Orion, execute SBD-1 and return to the moon. To effectively accomplish this goal and to eventually move on to Mars, the private sector must partner with the agency to commercialize LEO. Establishing a business case in LEO that is sufficiently robust to support a free-flying space station will not be simple or easy. As Bill Gerstenmaier has stressed many times before, the greatest challenge private sector companies face is finding ways to bolster true commercial demand for human spaceflight in LEO. As always, the ISS remains a critical asset and will play a vital role in serving as a laboratory not only for science, but for testing and building new business cases and commercial activities in LEO. However, for this to occur, obsolete rules and regulations must be reviewed and revised. For example, the Regulatory and Policy Committee will assess how to free American astronauts to fully support commercial activities on the ISS. American companies should not have to turn to Russian cosmonauts to execute commercial operations. When new industrial substances are created, commercial experiments conducted, or even advertisements filmed, American astronauts should lead the way. Speaking of astronauts, the committee will examine giving the freedom to pursue endorsements and other media opportunities. Our astronauts are American heroes and deserve to be treated as such.
Can I pause you right there?
Please.
So one of the reasons I think that's important, I mentioned the cereal box earlier. One of the reasons that's important, we now have Commercial astronauts. We're now going to be, because of Commercial Crew, which is a capability developed by NASA, we have astronauts that are going to be flying to the International Space Station that are not NASA astronauts. We've got right now, we've got a Boeing astronaut, and eventually we're talking about having a SpaceX astronaut, and even maybe not astronauts at all, but folks that are going for other purposes. They could be going for science or developing capabilities, or they could be going simply for tourism. So with all of this kind of thing developing, the question is this: if those astronauts are not limited in kind of the way they are able to promote themselves, then should NASA astronauts be limited in how we promote NASA? And I'm not saying that this is an easy challenge to address, but I will tell you from my perspective as a Navy pilot, we have a shortage in naval aviation that is drastic, and in Air Force aviation. I know we've got General Levy here as well. Why is that shortage there? Because you can go to the airlines and get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, or you can get paid much less by staying in the military. Now, we have kind of created that with this Commercial Crew, which is good. I want to be clear. I want the free market to work. But we also have to think about what is the future for NASA astronauts in this environment. So I wanted to make sure that we address that.
Certainly right here in Silicon Valley, I'm sure Dr. Tu can tell you how difficult it is to recruit and get people, and the expense of living out here. And speaking of branding, Mr. Administrator, I think we might have to charge Mountain Dew for this at some point. This is a good opportunity. So, as you say, we need to find ways to allow astronauts to engage with private sector companies and the media to ensure that the astronauts, NASA, and STEM return to a place of importance in popular culture. The nation should fully leverage our astronauts as ambassadors to inspire the engineers, mathematicians, and scientists of tomorrow. Beyond astronaut endorsements, the committee will tackle branding opportunities on hardware, including rockets and other spacecraft. Such branding will help enhance the exposure of space activities in the popular culture and will begin to validate a business case that future private sector operations will need to leverage.
So, Dr. Lyles, this goes right to the heart of your question. How do we make sure that America is aware of what we're doing? And we saw from Dr. Tu all the wonderful things that we are doing just here at this one center. We're doing a lot more across the entire agency. So one of the ways we can do that, and we're talking about potentially, is it possible for NASA to offset some of its costs by selling the naming rights to its spacecraft or the naming rights to its rockets, which I'm telling you, there is interest in that right now. The question is it possible? And the answer is, I don't know, but we need somebody to give us advice on whether or not it is.
Going beyond that, NASA can and should act as a catalyst for private sector LEO commercialization. To this end, the committee will explore equitable methods for NASA in collaboration with commercial crew providers to utilize excess seats for commercial activities and for reimbursed funds from those activities to be leveraged by the agency, potentially to purchase volume and/or services on private sector habitats to the ISS or free-flying commercial space stations. America must maintain a presence in LEO. The country is still experiencing the pain of human spaceflight transportation gap. We cannot allow history to repeat itself by saddling future generations with a space platform gap. We owe it to ourselves and our children to do better than that. And this committee will do its part to identify regulations and policies for the administrator's consideration in support of private sector LEO development. Looking forward to a future wherein LEO is populated with several private sector space stations, we must not lose the hard-fought victories of the ISS and the singular global collaboration that the station represents. Specifically, this committee will provide the administrator with recommendations on revising the ISS's intergovernmental agreement and expanding its scope potentially to include private sector habitats and stations. In addition to reviewing the IGA, the committee will explore NASA's role in supporting the regulatory streamlining articulated in SPD2. For example, second only to gravity, the ITAR has been the greatest barrier to the liftoff of many commercial space enterprises. The committee will explore how NASA can contribute to ensuring that when a product or service is widely available in the international marketplace, that commercial development is not held back when doing so only hurts American capabilities and interests. The committee has been tasked by the administrator to provide recommendations on SPD3 as well. We are in an era where hundreds of satellites can be deployed in a single launch. There has never been a more important time to tackle space traffic management, and this committee is eager to review and identify how NASA can help support the laudable goals and objectives of SPD3. Last, but certainly not least, the committee will examine regulations preventing the harmful contamination of the Moon, Mars, and other celestial bodies. We need to adopt policies that meet the invaluable principles of the Outer Space Treaty, but do so in a manner that ambitious commercial missions to the Moon or Mars are not unnecessarily hindered or outright prohibited. These are all substantial challenges, and the committee will soon be populated with a team of regulatory and policy experts who are working on the front lines of commercial space to tackle this ambitious agenda. Again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve on the NAC, thank the administrator, and to work with NASA at this critical juncture, and look forward to helping the agency achieve escape velocity from red tape.
Escape velocity from red tape. So you hit a lot of things in there that could be perceived as provocative. And I want to be clear, we have not made any determinations, nor have we prejudged the outcome of the committee that you're going to chair. But we talk about commercializing low Earth orbit in a way where there is no gap in low Earth orbit. We want to make sure that from the International Space Station to whatever comes next, and there's going to have to be something that comes next because it can't last forever, in that process, how do we commercialize low Earth orbit? And there's lots of things that can be done. Some of the challenges that I've heard about as the administrator is that our astronauts are prohibited from doing certain experiments that are on board the ISS because those experiments might one day make a profit for a company that has purchased access to the ISS. Now, this could be, the idea, what does NASA do? NASA works to retire risk and commercialize capabilities so that we can move on to other things. And so, I see that did you want to address that?
Well, capitalism works really well here on Earth. There's no reason we shouldn't be embracing it in the
Okay, got it. Well, the idea, though, you mentioned if our commercial crew partners have 7 seats, how do we take advantage of those 7 seats for them in a way that helps their bottom line and at the same time offsets our cost? And is that feasible? Is it possible legally, regulatorily? And so the goal here ultimately is to commercialize low Earth orbit, to make sure there's no gap in low Earth orbit. And when I say commercialize, we're talking about industries that could be formed around low Earth orbit in a microgravity environment. Some of the things that we've talked about are pharmaceuticals, for example, development of, no kidding, this came out in the last National Space Council meeting, chaired by the Vice President. There was a gentleman there from Indiana. I wonder how that happened. But he had a story to tell about the ability to use adult stem cells to 3D print human organs in a microgravity environment in a way you can't do on Earth. And if we can prove that capability out on the International Space Station and then use that as part of the market that can keep that commercial capability going, maybe even outside the International Space Station or on the International Space Station with offsets to cost, those are all good things for our country. So,
I would say, Mr. Administrator, that I believe in this. I've worked my entire life on these commercial activities. It will happen. The question is, will it happen in America? And this committee will be committed to developing policies that make it easy, that will facilitate it happening here, because if we don't take these actions, just like you're describing with other policy and regulations, it will go overseas.
That's great. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing, we're going to start populating that committee with experts from across the country with a broad, a very diverse set of views and capabilities and backgrounds, and ultimately seeing where that goes and what is in the realm of possibility, because right now we don't know, but we're going to start asking these tough and in some cases provocative questions so at the end of the day we can get from point A to point B in the fastest way possible. So appreciate you jumping in to tackle that. The other
Jim,
thing
I feel very, very positive
Yes.
about the ability of Mike's committee and the whole council to really take on these things very seriously. No pun intended. I think the stars are aligned right now. You mentioned obviously SPD1, SPD2, SPD3, but also the National Space Council and the User Advisory Group as part of that council. If I look at the tasking given from the White House to the Space Council and User Advisory Group, they're right along the same lines of tackling those barriers, those policy, those regulatory issues that are getting in the way. So the stars are aligned. I think we can have nothing but success ahead of us.
And you also serve on the User Advisory Group of the National Space Council.
Yes, sir.
So you're going to get a very unique perspective that you can bring to us on
I
this.
am. I'm flunking retirement badly, but I'm going to get it.
Okay, well, good. So to that point, I want to also talk about something else that's important for our country right now. We have had, in the history of our country, we've had national space councils in the past. They have not always been effective. I'm here to tell you that as far as I can tell, the one we have right now is being very effective. And of course, they're appointing great people to serve on the user advisory group of the National Space Council. So I'll just kind of define for maybe some people in the room that are not aware what that is. NASA is not the only agency that's involved in space. And of course, the Department of Defense people are familiar with, the intelligence community people are familiar with, but the Department of Transportation is involved in space as well, from the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The Commerce Department is involved in space now with NOAA and other regulatory capabilities that they have. And of course, under Space Policy Directives 2 and 3, they're going to be a lot more involved in space. So all of the heads of these agencies, the secretaries of these agencies, serve on the National Space Council, the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Commerce, of course the NASA Administrator, and others. And we collaborate on ultimately what are the policies that will enable the American space enterprise to remain preeminent. And of course, in this particular case, the council is chaired by the Vice President of the United States, who is very actively engaged. He has visited Kennedy twice, visited Johnson twice, visited Marshall and JPL. He's taking a personal interest in this. Everything I just mentioned is specific to NASA, but he's done a lot more that includes the interagency. So we're in great shape. I'll also say on that point that, that we've got great bipartisan support in Congress. The president's budget request increased NASA by $1 billion. When you have a 19-point-something billion-dollar budget, $1 billion is a lot. And even before I got here to go advocate for that new $1 billion, Congress had plussed up NASA by $1.7 billion. So this is strong bipartisan support from the administration. Part of what I hope this group can achieve is making sure that NASA remains apolitical, remains bipartisan, so that this is good for our country in its entirety, and not focused on things that can divide us, but things that can unite us, and being able to do more than we've ever done before. So, General, I'll let you open it up to others.
Other questions and comments from the council members? Yes, Amy?
Good afternoon, Mr. Administrator. I would love to hear your thoughts about how you see the role of the agency in preparing the STEM workforce of the future, not just for the agency, but really for our entire country.
Wonderful question. So there was a time in my life before I was in the House and before I was the NASA Administrator, I ran a nonprofit, Tulsa Air and Space Museum. And it was a great opportunity for me to see firsthand how NASA, uniquely, can impact the lives of children. So, and not just impact their lives, but really kind of change the direction of their course. And the reason I was so interested in that, even to lead this nonprofit museum, when I was young, I think it was the summer after my 5th grade and before my 6th grade year, I had the opportunity to go and go to a summer camp where I got to manipulate and play with a wind tunnel. And it really, I learned about Bernoulli's theory, and I learned about the camber of a wing and, lift and drag and all the fundamentals and how to make those things change by changing the shape of the wing. I learned that the summer between, I think it was the summer between my 5th and 6th grade year. But, at that point, it was in my mind from that point forward that I wanted to be involved in aviation. And so, in fact, in those days, I had a picture hanging on my wall of a NASA. And in fact, it was a multi-agency kind of program, DARPA and others. But it was an X-29, a forward swept-wing aircraft. And all I knew back then is that this thing looked really cool. And I had to put it on my wall. And I did. And as I grew older, I started learning about why would we ever want to prove out a forward swept-wing aircraft, and learning about the trade-off between maneuverability and stability. Like you can have both, but you can't have both at the same time. And ultimately, the idea that the more maneuverable you make an aircraft, which is what you get with a forward swept wing moving at high speeds, the more you're not going to be able to control it as a pilot. And in fact, it wouldn't be controllable. But because of NASA technology and NASA investment, we were able to create flight control computers that actually could control it. And at the same time, forward swept wings flying at that speed, it was an F-5 airframe, but with that forward swept wing, it would go sufficiently fast to where it would actually come apart under normal circumstances. Well, at the time, early 80s, maybe late 70s, really when it first started, the development of composite materials where you could actually strengthen the wing much stronger than it would otherwise be and not pay a weight penalty. So the forward swept wing gave us, composite kind of capabilities. It gave us flight control computer capabilities. And I started learning about these things and wanting to know more. And eventually I came to the point in my life when I graduated from college, I was interested in maybe, I was interviewing for, investment banking positions and consulting positions and didn't want to do any of it. I wanted to be in aviation. And I wanted to be in aviation because of these experiences I had growing up, whether it was the wind tunnel or the X-29 or might add something to do with the movie Top Gun as well. I don't remember. But at the end of the day, these are the kind of things that inspire children to do different activities that are good for the country. And if we as an agency, look, if we want to inspire that next generation for STEM, which I think is critically important for the good of our country, NASA has to do stunning things. That's why I'm a big believer in the X-plane capabilities that we have as a nation. We can do computational fluid dynamics and see kind of, what happens on a computer. But at the end of the day, if you can fly an airplane and kids can see that airplane fly and they can put that poster on their wall, that's how you get folks excited. And by the way, that's all critically important as well. It's not just for the STEM, it's also for the development of technology. So I'm a big advocate of NASA's STEM mission. And in fact, if you spend 5 minutes at the headquarters asking people, why do you work for NASA? They can give you all sorts of things that happened in their past that made them want to one day work at this agency. And one of the things, depending on the age group that you talk to, everybody remembers where they were when Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And that has been monumental for so many people that work in the STEM fields in this country, including people that are sitting around this table right now. So look, NASA has a big role to play here. We need stunning achievements. We need to do things that are cool, and we need to make sure that we're communicating that to the previous conversation, communicating that to the world. We talked about the potential, is it possible for us to sell the naming rights on a rocket? Why would we want to do that as NASA? Don't get me wrong, we want to brand NASA. But why would we want to sell the naming rights? Well, because then those private companies can then embed in their marketing campaigns NASA. We can embed NASA into the culture and the fabric of American society and inspire generations of folks that will create those next capabilities to keep America preeminent, not only in space, but in science and technology and discovery and exploration. So thank you for that question.
Other questions from the council members? Yes, Minnie and then John.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator.
Yes.
There is some really incredible science that could be facilitated and it could be implemented as part of the implementation of Space Policy Directive 1, and in all areas of the NASA science portfolio. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you might prioritize some of the science that might happen.
Another great question and important for the agency. And I'm glad you asked it because I want to make sure before my time here ends, I'm going to ask Thomas to talk. Thomas Zurbuchen, the Associate Administrator of the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. I'm going to ask him to talk about some things. But it's a good question. And I'll tell you how I think about it, because I talked for a second about why we want to make sure NASA remains apolitical and nonpartisan, because ultimately that's how we're going to be able to do more and find a lot of support in the House and in the Senate. In order for me to achieve that objective of remaining apolitical and bipartisan, I'm going to follow the guidance that comes from the National Academy of Sciences through their decadal surveys. So when you think about those decadal surveys, you've got astrophysics and earth science and heliophysics and planetary science. We're going to follow the guidance of those decadal surveys for the purpose of making sure that we are dispassionately going the directions that the science community wants us to go as they have reached consensus, which is that's the purpose of doing that. Now, as you mentioned the moon, you mentioned Space Policy Directive 1, that means we're going to the moon, and how does that relate to science? Well, there is a history at NASA where what you do at the moon is not science. It's part of the Human Exploration Mission Directorate, and science is everything other than the moon that goes either beyond the moon or maybe back to heliophysics, et cetera. All of that being the case, we need to think kind of transdisciplinary, in a transdisciplinary way, about what science is at the moon. Because again, 1969 to 2008, we thought the moon was bone dry. What else do we not know about the moon, and how much can we learn? So we're going to be looking at those decadal surveys and having them inform the direction that we go. But ultimately, we need to be clear that there is a lot of science at the moon that we have yet to understand. And so I'd like to, one of the things that we're going to do, not today, but in the future, and I wasn't planning to talk about this necessarily today, but I will. Anyway, we'll make some more news today, why not? We're going to eventually get to a point where we're going to stand up a committee within this group that is focused on science at the moon specifically. And the reason we want to do that in a collaboration between human exploration and science is because there's a lot of synergies here that maybe historically haven't been optimized. So if you'll talk for a second, Thomas, about that.
Thank you so much. You know, just like you, I believe the moon is a body of the solar system that's worthy of exploration by itself. Why would it be the only body that's not?
Right.
Right. And for me, that never made sense. And needless to say, there is important information in the last decadal even of the planetary sciences that pointed to questions at the moon that we have no clue about what the answer is. Some of them are related to the entire water cycles, the multiple sources of water, and so forth. What's also important is once we unlock the opportunities on the surface of the moon or near the moon as part of the gateway or the other infrastructure that's there, we can answer questions in other disciplines that cannot be answered in any other fashion. And I want to remind the listeners that there is a window in the electromagnetic spectrum we've never seen, we've never listened, and that is very low frequency radio astrophysics. That the Earth is too noisy, the sun is too noisy. So we want to make those observations on the backside of the moon when it's dark. See, the sun is and the Earth, all the noise is shut off by the moon. So that's a real opportunity. There's other questions like that, and the committee that you're referring to will look at both science off the moon, but also science that can be addressed using that infrastructure near the moon and on the surface of the moon in a multidisciplinary fashion. In every one of those disciplines, we're aware of questions for which this kind of investigation is very much worth the investment. And yes, we want to look at the National Academy's decadals to help prioritize that, but it's something that we really want guidance from the broader community.
That's great. That's great to hear. Bill, did you want to, obviously this is a collaboration between HEO and science. Did you want to add anything to that?
You know, I think, again, you'll get a chance to hear when the committee chairs get up and talk a little bit. We did a joint Human Exploration Operations Committee with the Science Committee meeting yesterday, and there was a really good exchange between those two committees on exciting ideas. They can use the facilities of the Gateway, they can do surface activities, the science that can enable, and that synergistic action back and forth was really, really positive. I think you'll get a chance to hear some recommendations and some findings later today from both of those committees on what they heard from that discussion. But I think this is a really rich environment for us. Together, teaming together, working together, we can achieve much more than we could individually doing exploration or doing science alone. But by doing exploration and science together, it's a much, much richer way of doing activities in space.
That's great to hear. General?
Jim, we'll take one more question from John Borghese, and then we'll do a wrap-up here before we lose the air.
Okay.
Thank you, Administrator, for your discussion on space policy and that we want to maintain our leadership in space. We're also leaders in aeronautics as well, shown by our $187 billion of exports of aerospace material. And that's due, in large part, due to NASA's innovation over the last several years and the continuing innovation they're doing in supersonic research as well as unmanned air traffic management and air vehicles. Can you describe a little bit about the policy for aeronautics as well?
Yeah, no, that's an important point. I'm reminded frequently that the first A in NASA is for aeronautics specifically. We talked a little bit about some of the X-planes, especially, well, the X-29 historically, but right now we're doing the low boom flight demonstrator so that we can fly across the United States in a fraction of the amount of the time. And while there will be a sonic boom, we want to minimize that sonic boom to where it's more of a rumble. And in fact, maybe even imperceptible on the Earth, so we can fly across the United States and really across the world faster than we've ever been able to do before. But that's just one experiment. Another experiment that we're doing, X-37 Maxwell, we're going to actually fly the world's first all-electric aircraft that's capable of carrying humans and cargo, which has never been done before, but in this particular case, NASA is going to accomplish that. The idea being, the purpose of these X-planes is not that we're going to build fleets of these planes, but we're going to retire risk for the technology, and then that technology, again, we're going to publish it. We're going to make it available to the public. And then companies that have an interest in this kind of thing, after we have retired the risk, they can take it and they can commercialize it and enable us, as you mentioned, which I think is perfect, we can use this as a way of maintaining America's edge in aviation so that we can keep this as a big part of our export capability. You know, people don't realize a lot of times, they hear a lot about the trade deficit and the balance of payments is not equitable. But in aviation specifically, we have a surplus in trade. It is somewhat offsetting the trade deficit, which is a good thing. Now, we're going to have to work really hard to maintain that leadership. NASA does that, and the X-planes are a big piece of it. But also, as you're aware, you know, the way we're using turbofan engines these days, we're seeing bigger and bigger turbofan engines because of reduction gear capability between the turbine and the fan of an engine, which all of that technology and capability developed by NASA, enabling us to export engines as well as aircraft. So what I have to do as the NASA administrator, and of course getting advice from this prestigious group, we have to figure out at the end of the day what capabilities and technologies help us maintain our edge and have the highest probability of being commercialized for an export capability to help the United States maintain its preeminence in aviation. And of course, NASA has a long history of doing this, and we want to be able to continue doing this. And so with the advice of you and others on your committee, we want to keep doing that. So I know, General Isles, you mentioned that we're kind of at the end of the road here because of time.
Actually, it turns out I think we have just a couple more minutes, and so would like one, I was wrong, one last question, and Miles,
Okay.
I'll leave that to you.
Well, first of all, a tip of the rabbit ears to you for allowing NASA, the NASA Advisory Council on television.
Oh, yeah.
It took about as long as it took to get to the moon, but we're here.
Okay.
So if we can send a man to the moon, we can put the NAC on TV. And my next proposal is going to be a dedicated fax machine for incoming comments from people. So technology is getting pretty crazy here. I want to talk about my favorite planet, Earth, and the Earth Science Enterprise. This is an administration from the top on down that has expressed either skepticism or denial of climate science, yourself included, at least on one occasion. To what extent will that affect priorities, allocation of resources in the Earth Science Enterprise at NASA?
It's a great question, Miles. A couple of things that I think are important to address. Number one, if you look at the President's budget request on Earth science specific to NASA, it is higher than 3 of the budget requests from President Obama, which I think is a demonstration of the commitment to understanding how our climate changes and is changing. So I think that's an important point, and it's on par with the 4th. So we're healthy there. Of course, there can be debates about whether or not we need to do more. But again, my goal as the NASA administrator is to follow the guidance that comes from the decadal surveys. In this particular case, there's a decadal survey specific to earth science, and we're going to follow that guidance. And I have a history. You know, a lot of times, you mentioned the narrative on me. It might not entirely be accurate. You can imagine in the political realm, when somebody gets nominated, one side of the aisle thinks that they're excellent, and the other side of the aisle thinks that they're terrible, and they're going to generate their narratives, and sometimes you get caught in the crossfire in that. But here's the thing. My history as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I was very involved in an amendment to make sure that, in fact, it was offered by Jim Langevin from Rhode Island, a friend of mine in the House of Representatives, and he said he wanted the Department of Defense to do a study on how climate change is affecting our national security posture. And as a Navy pilot, you know, I had some experience here, and as you can imagine, Democrats were against it, and Republicans Democrats were for the amendment, Republicans were against the amendment. And I actually stood up on my side of the aisle and said, no, wait a second. As a Navy pilot, we're having to defend territory we never used to even have to defend. And our potential adversaries are operating in territory they never used to be able to operate in. And why is that? Well, it's because the Arctic ice isn't there anymore. You know, we can pretend that it is there, but it's not. And so this does affect our national security posture. And I made that argument on the Armed Services Committee as a member of the House long before I ever had the opportunity to be nominated for NASA. And of course, I've been a strong advocate of a whole host of earth science missions, including PACE as a member of Congress. And I've made those arguments as well, because we need to understand the sources of carbon and the sinks of carbon. I can tell you this, and nobody that I know rejects this on either side of the aisle: carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It is. I don't know anybody that says that it's not. And we know that we've put more of it into the atmosphere than we ever have before. And so we are, in fact, responsible for the warming of the climate. Now, here's what we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. I was just down at JPL just 2 days ago, and of course, you know, they've got all their literature and why they do all of this earth science kind of capability on behalf of NASA. And of course, they were going through all of the things we don't know, and that's what NASA is for. We're for trying to understand more. When you think about the lithosphere and the hydrosphere and the cryosphere and the biosphere, you think about biology. We're seeing a greening of the Earth right now because there's increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's actually happening. So ultimately, the question is, how do all of these different changes as a result of this, is it destabilizing or is it stabilizing? And in some cases, these feedback mechanisms are destabilizing, and sometimes they're stabilizing. But what we know about these subsystems of the Earth system, we know because of NASA. Now, my goal is to prevent NASA from becoming political or partisan. That's my objective as the NASA administrator. In order to do that, we're going to follow the guidance of the decadal surveys, and we're going to do dispassionate science. We're going to get the data, get the information, we're going to share it. I'll tell you what we're not going to do, though. We're not going to prescribe what the solution is, because as soon as NASA delves into that, then people are going to line up on one side or the other, and we lose our bipartisan capability. So others can say, you know, what we ought to be doing, but NASA shouldn't. We should do dispassionate science. We should get the data, get the information, share it with the world in a robust way, and then have policymakers debate. That's ultimately what we can and should do. So thank you for the question. It's important. It's part of who we are as an agency. By the way, it goes back to the creation of NASA. At the very creation of NASA, there was a mission in there to understand planet Earth, which is, of course, this tiny blue marble in a sea of space. So thank you for the question. And General Lyles, I want to be really clear about how grateful I am for your leadership of this committee and your shepherding of this. And to the extent that we get recommendations and advice, know that we're going to take it very seriously. And I and the leadership at NASA, we will take it to heart and do everything we can to keep America preeminent in science, space, technology, and of course, exploration and discovery. So thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very exciting time period for NASA in all of its responsibilities, and we're very excited about your leadership and very excited about the things we have that are challenges in some people's minds, but to me, they're great opportunities for NASA and for our country. So
Awesome.
thank you very much. Please join me in a round of applause for Jim Bridenstine, and NASA Administrator.
Thank you, General. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thank you.